Chances are you're familiar with the Disney Pixar animated film Up, or at least the image of elderly Carl's house, lifted away by balloons from the oppressive overdevelopment that had overwhelmed his neighborhood and his dreams. As the filmmakers were working on Carl's story, they discovered the real-life story of this little bungalow in the Ballard section of Seattle, a house, like Carl's, which was being surrounded by massive development. The movie's marketers decorated it in a 2009 publicity event for the film. The bungalow belonged to a woman named Edith Macefield. Edith first lived in the house when the area had other small bungalows. Like Carl, Edith was a person with big dreams, but for most of her life, this little house was home. By the time developers knocked on Edith's door in 2006, almost all of her neighbors had already gone. Edith refused to sell her home, so they built around her, a project that loomed over, darkened, and isolated the little house and the little old lady inside it. But Edith lived there resourcefully until her death in 2008. After the release of Up, Edith's house became a place of pilgrimage for many who left balloons in her honor. There are plans to lift and move the home to a scenic island to house a family in need there.
Hi, I'm Tess of Livable Ballard.
And I'm Bill, a community advocate and a former city council candidate.
And behind us is what's left of the Up House. The Up House in Ballard became a story across the world of one person's principled stand against development. It's also a metaphor for upzoning in Ballard and its negative effects: more and bigger construction, increasing housing prices, gentrification, homelessness, and a lower quality of life.
What's happened to Ballard is instructive, because Newton is facing now the kind of powerful upzoning and overdevelopment pressures Ballard confronted a decade ago. Will Newton be transformed as Ballard has been? Ballard and Newton are similar in many ways. Ballard was settled in 1853 and incorporated as a small town when the railroad arrived in 1889. The population then grew quickly, and Ballard reluctantly agreed in 1907 to be annexed into the city of Seattle to access Seattle's fresh water supply. For most of the next century, Ballard was an area with a diverse mix of residents, including workers in timber and wood products, shipping, fishermen, shopkeepers, and business people. Newton was settled in 1630, incorporated as a town in 1688, and grew rapidly after the railroad arrived in 1834. A town of farms, riverside mills, and grand summer houses for Boston's elite, Newton adopted a city form of government in 1873, in part to stave off annexation by Boston. Newton became an exemplar of the Garden City philosophy of self-contained development, balanced between commercial, residential, and open space, while also being a streetcar suburb of Boston.
One difference between Ballard and Newton is that Washington State is a planned state with an emphasis on centralized state and regional planning and decision-making.
In contrast, Newton is a beneficiary of the Northeast's tradition of home rule and local land use decision-making. Another difference is their respective state population growth rates, keeping in mind that places that promote growth tend to get it. U.S. Census data show that from 2010 to 2015, Washington's population growth rate was 6.6%, well above the national average of 4.1%. Massachusetts grew more slowly than the national average at only 3.77%. Between 2013 and 2014, Seattle's population grew 2.3%, while Boston's grew less than 1%. There's more population and regulatory pressure on Ballard to force more intense housing land use than there is on Newton, but it's political and speculative pressures that really drive growth in both.
In 1990, the state of Washington enacted the Growth Management Act. It required local municipalities to incorporate growth targets as part of regional growth planning. 38 neighborhoods in Seattle, including Ballard, were designated as urban villages, appropriate for much more intense development. During this period, official neighborhood planning process engaged thousands of citizens to participate in deciding how to meet the growth targets they had been assigned. At first, infill housing units, while crowded, at least matched the scale of existing neighborhoods. In 2010, at the insistence of developers, the zoning codes were changed to allow far more intense development, and buildings no longer match what are in neighborhoods.
As the millennium came to a close, the tech boom in Seattle led to enormous pressure for real estate redevelopment. Elected officials and the developers and tech giants who fund their campaigns pushed for, quote, higher value, unquote, uses of land, or property speculation. Within the past decade, nearly 20 major condo retail projects were underway or had just been completed within a 5-block radius of downtown Ballard, adding some 2,500 new households to the neighborhood. In 2010, Seattle did a virtual upzone by allowing significantly more density in low-rise zones, ostensibly to provide greater affordability. Allowed building heights were raised, lot coverages increased, limits on the number of units on a parcel were removed, and requirements for providing parking on site were removed for many areas. As highly paid millennial tech workers, willing to pay higher rents for smaller units, poured into the area, families and less affluent renters were displaced. Single-family homeowners were and are besieged with offers and threats from developers seeking to buy and demolish their houses to build towers of high-priced studios and micro-units. Despite the non-stop construction of rental units, between 2010 and 2015, Seattle saw the fastest rise in rents of any place in the U.S. So much for added supply, lowering prices. With so many added units, Ballard has reached 427% of the 20-year growth target it was set in 1994. In fact, Ballard has already exceeded its updated growth target through 2024.
Seattle no longer has a legitimate community engagement process. What they have now I call engagement theater. It's where residents are invited to participate in these superficial exercises, often involving Legos or Post-it notes. And this creates the appearance of community engagement and buy-in without really inviting substantial residential input on important issues.
The change has been dramatic. 50% of Seattle was zoned single-family, and 62% of Seattle's tree canopy was located in single-family zones. From 2001 to 2007, single-family lots undergoing redevelopment lost 41% of their tree canopy, while multi-unit lots lost 69%. Along with trees and green space, naturally affordable homes have been lost to higher-use redevelopment in the name of affordable housing. Rents on newer units are more than 50% higher than comparable older units. Many renters and small businesses have been displaced, and Seattle's homelessness problem has increased dramatically as housing prices have soared. The added housing has come with an insufficient increase in infrastructure, transit, or fire or police hires. With insufficient public safety staff, crime rates are on the rise. Politicians, tech leaders, and developers value the exchange value of land, its speculative value, not the value of the use to which it is currently put. Community coherence, security, historic preservation, green space, none of these matter.
As early as the 1970s, economists began documenting the process and effects of urban redevelopment and densification. Sociologist Harvey Molotch coined the term urban growth machine to describe the collective actions of the various parties that benefit from intense urban infill. The bankers, investors, developers, construction trades, and even city government looking to grow its tax base. Collectively, the growth machine has an insatiable appetite for growth at any cost. but this growth is unsustainable and benefits few while hurting many.
There's really no relief in sight for Ballard, where pro-growth media and city leadership are doing everything that they can to demonize single-family neighborhoods.
One even proposed a highest use tax that would charge residents not on the home they actually have, but on the highest possible use of their property, for those who continue to live in single-family houses in areas rezoned multifamily, to encourage turnover. Seattle's mayor recently introduced the Housing Affordability and Livability Agenda, or HALA, requiring still more mandatory upzoning in Ballard. This map resembles Newton's now infamous Lego map, the one where consultants told residents at a charrette they were required to put 300 Legos on a map of Newton to indicate where apartment buildings and townhomes should replace houses. Along with manipulative resident engagement events, the administration is embarking on a zoning reform process that many believe is focused on upzoning. Mayor Warren wants to build 3,200 new housing units, even though Newton has satisfied its 40B affordable housing requirement. Between lax zoning enforcement, inexpensive demolition permits, and special permits given out like nothing special, Newton's zoning ordinance is under siege, and so is our community. Tear-downs are rampant, and so are replacement builds. McMansions, townhouses, multi-units, and apartment and condo complexes. All of them mean tremendous tree loss and displacement of people who cannot keep up with the higher housing prices brought by higher use redevelopment. Can we save Newton from Ballard's fate? What can we learn about the dangers of upzoning from the Seattle neighborhood that's home to the real-life Up House?
So Tess, my first question is going to be for you. You have lived in Ballard for almost 20 years. When you moved there, were you expecting your neighborhood to change the drastic way that it has?
No, when I first moved to Ballard, it was very much a quiet maritime community with a lot of fishermen, and rents were very affordable. And though there was some urban infill that was starting at that time, it was so moderate in scale that it kind of went unnoticed. So it wasn't until the changes of 2010 that I really began to notice an acceleration of development, and the changes that occurred were very rapid at that point.
Bill, I want to ask you about Seattle generally, as you don't live in Ballard, but you live in the central district of the city. Are the dramatic changes in Ballard happening all over? So are they happening in your area of Seattle as well?
Yeah, Seattle in general is growing at a very rapid clip. It's been about a 10% population growth increase in about the last 5 years. It's been very, very rapid. A lot of this has to do with the rapid expansion of our tech sector. Amazon, Expedia, and other companies at Google are expanding very quickly in the city, and that has put a very intense demand on housing for us.
I'd also like to frame this discussion. We saw a little bit in the introductory video, but to reiterate a little bit of the differences between our two communities, between Newton and Ballard. So Washington is one of the fastest growing states, and Seattle one of the fastest growing cities in the country. And that is partly because of policy choices that promote high density. Massachusetts, by contrast, and greater Boston are growing much more slowly. Nevertheless, Newton is independent of Boston, so even though what happens in Boston affects us a great deal, our elected leaders do have the power to take measures to protect us from the spillover effects. We have a tradition of home rule, that is less state and regional control over things like weather and how we grow, whereas Ballard part of Seattle has more centralized and regionalized control over local density, even setting growth target levels that Ballard is legally required to meet. It seems like Washington state leaders decided some time ago to promote growth at all costs. Setting growth targets is one way to do that, as we've seen. So conversely, here in Newton, and I think it's true for the suburbs in many eastern Massachusetts towns, people expect stability in zoning and their community. And we react oftentimes negatively to sudden high-density intrusions into the neighborhood in which we've invested our lives and our life savings. So my question is, did people in Ballard have similar expectations of stability? And if so, what specifically happened? Do Seattle, Ballard residents in particular accept the high-density transformation? Do they work to counter it or feel powerless to change it? And I think that's for either one of you if you'd care to address that.